What's going on, it's Suk and I'm back with a brand new video on SuperDuprTech. And in today's video, I shall be showing you the results that I got when benchmarking the 2023 M2 Pro powered 16-inch MacBook Pro. As always, the spec for the model that I am testing will be left down below in this video's description. Also, we are on the road to 5,000 subscribers, so if you are new around here, then I must ask you to hit the subscribe button, clicking the bell to be notified of when a new video goes live. Without any further ado, let's hit the titles. The first few benchmarking applications which I threw at this MacBook Pro were from GeekBench. The first of these being GeekBench 4. GeekBench runs several different tests on the machine, and once they've been completed, it will then score the machine based on the time taken to complete those tasks. On the CPU test, I got a single core score of 6,702 and a multi-core score of 43,589. I then ran their compute test, and when testing the OpenCL performance, I got a score of 185,999. And when running this test through Metal, I got a score of 148,175. I then ran GeekBench 5, starting off with its CPU test. I got a single core score of 1,492 and a multi-core score of 11,678. And running the GeekBench 5 compute test, I got an OpenCL score of 42,741, and when running the Metal compute test, I got a score of 47,806. Running the latest version of GeekBench, GeekBench 6, starting off once again with the CPU test, I got a single core score of 2,677 and a multi-core score of 14,435. And when running the compute test, I got an OpenCL score of 50,667, and when testing the compute performance through Metal, I got a score of 82,524. Sticking with the trend of testing the CPU, I ran CineBench R23, and this test gave me a single core score of 1,656 and a multi-core score of 14,779, which indeed gives us a ratio of 8.93. The next application that I ran on this MacBook Pro was NovaBench 2. Now, NovaBench runs several different tests on all aspects of the machine, from the memory and storage to the CPU and GPU. Now, for this test, it yielded a result of 2,790. I then tested the storage on this MacBook Pro, and whilst I was hopeful to see some improvements here, they never were seen. In fact, this MacBook Pro this time around has overall worse performance when compared to the previous generation MacBook Pro models. Coming in with a write speed of 4,699 and a read speed of 2,709, compared to the M1 Pro powered MacBook Pro models, it's around 10% slower on the right side, but it's an astounding 30% slower when it comes to reading files from this SSD. I then wanted to test how well this machine would perform graphically, so I ran GFXBench Metal. I will be calculating the average for the higher and lower intensive tasks, whilst I will as always be showing you each individual result. So the average I got for the higher intensive task was 420.78 frames per second, whereas for the lower I got a score of 358.13 frames per second. Sticking to testing the GPU portion of the M2 Pro, I ran several tests from 3DMark, starting off with their wildlife test, which honestly was useless as it had maxed out this test, with it clocking in 120 frames per second. And whilst running the wildlife stress test, I got a higher score of 20,040 and a lower score of 20,028. And when I ran the wildlife extreme test, I got a score of 12,806 with an FPS of 76.7 frames per second, which was a solid improvement compared to the 14-inch MacBook Pro, which got 66.6 frames per second. So you can certainly see those 2 additional graphics cores coming in clutch. And whilst running the Wildlife Extreme stress test, the best score I achieved was 12,837, whilst the lowest I achieved was 12,788, which is a decrease in performance of less than 0.4%, which is really negligible. Sticking to testing the GPU or the graphics on this MacBook Pro, I then chose to run Valley and Heaven from Unigine benchmarking tools. And whilst running Heaven, I got an average FPS of 142.7 frames per second and a score of 3,594. And whilst running the Valley test, I got an average FPS of 123.3 frames per second and a score of 5,160. I then ran the Shadow of a Tomb Raider benchmark at 2560 by 1600, which rendered out 6,428 frames with an average FPS of 40 frames per second. And when I lowered that resolution to 1920 by 1200, it managed this time to render 10,164 frames with an average FPS of 64 frames per second. I then ran the V-Ray test and got a score of 9,598. When running Blender on this MacBook Pro to render the classroom scene using the CPU, it took 5 minutes and 49 seconds to complete, and when using the GPU portion of the M2 Pro, it took 1 minute and 31 seconds to complete. And whilst rendering the BMW scene, it took 2 minutes and 28 seconds to complete using the CPU, but when switching over to the GPU, it took 43 seconds to complete. I then did a timed Final Cut Pro export, exporting a 5-minute 24-second video file to H.264. I exported as both a Full HD and a 4K video file. It is worth noting that prior to exporting this project, that background rendering was indeed turned off. So when exporting the Full HD video file, it took 44 seconds to complete this, and when exporting this file as a 4K video project, it took 2 minutes and 37 seconds to complete. I then did a network speed test and got a download speed of 571 megabits per second and an upload of 101 megabits per second. I also ran the AnTuTu HTML benchmark and got a score of 74,337. And when running the Speedometer 2.0 HTML test, I got a score of 431. So there you have it, that's it for today's video. Of course, if you've got any questions or if there's anything that you would like to see further tested, then be sure to drop me a comment down below in the comment section, or alternatively you can hit me up on my social media, links to which can be found down below in this video's description. Once again, if you are new around here, then be sure to subscribe clicking the bell icon to be notified of when a new video goes live. But as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care and have a good one.